Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
And here with us from Canada, from across the pond, fantasy author K.V. Johansen. Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
We are glad to have you on. And also, dear listeners, our first live guests from Germany, our neighbors. Hello, Frankfurt.
Hello. Hello, Vienna, and hello, Canada.
And a warm applause for our guest.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, KV, you are a weaver of worlds and teller of tales.
Yep.
And yes, you are. And according to your website, Lord of the Rings is to blame for that.
Yes, it is. I read it when I was very young, and then I read it again and again and again. I was 8 when I read it, and it just sort of soaked into me, just that love of language, and sort of history, and this idea of a world that has like layers and layers and layers of stories underlying the main story that you're reading. That just sort of, I don't know, got into me somehow and shaped how I looked at stories and how I read other things, and gave me quite an interest in history and in languages. And well, probably the urge to write stories myself or to tell stories was always there, but it shaped how that developed, I think.
And your books, I mean, this is a series, actually.
Yes.
They are all interwoven with each other, and it is a very elaborate kind of world building you did in your books.
Gods of the Caravan Road began with just one character in a situation, and sort of his story expanded, and it kept pushing the map, making the map larger, and other characters came in, and then they had history that went down and back underneath everything. And so the series ended up covering a couple hundred years, and then there's a couple hundred years before it that you kind of find out things. There are sort of other stories from that then become told in the course of the main thread of adventures. So, yeah, it was very interesting. I didn't know where it was going to go when I began it.
Okay. So, did you start at one point planning all the different events so that they fit together in the timeline?
No, I'm not very good at the long-term planning. So,
did you have to correct something because you discovered it doesn't fit?
Yes, I occasionally had to do that. Between Black Dog, the first book, and The Leopard and the Lady, which are they're really one story cut in two, but so that's the second and third book, The Leopard and the Lady. There's this gap of time, and it worked for one group of characters who were doing other things during that time. And for another pair of characters, it made no sense at all that it took them that long to get to the city where the story was happening. And so I had to sort of figure out, like, what were they doing? Why didn't they go off and like deal with their part of the story? Like, and that would of course ruined everything because everyone had to be there at the same time. But then I realized there were sort of two things going on. One of them is that one of the characters is sort of fighting depression through the whole series, and she tends to try to avoid getting involved in things and doing the things that she needs to do. And so she's very much someone who, well, she just sort of wanders off into the wilderness and doesn't come back for, 100 years, 3 years, 6 months, whatever's convenient for the plot, but also for herself. She tends to do that. And then there was also the fact that one of the her partner is a werebear. He's a demon. He's a bear by day and a man by night. And they're crossing desert and things, and he's going to get heat stroke. So he got sick when they went into the deserts, and so this was sort of just kind of mentioned in passing as a joke much later, that they'd been wandering around a lot, but also that like he got heat stroke. She picked a fight with a god, and the god who's not in the story, and it's a little wild god, and ended up killing it. And basically all these bad things happened. So they went off.
Mm-hmm.
This is why it took them 2 years or whatever it was to get to the next story, when they should have been able to travel it in a few months.
Okay.
So I do things like that. I had to do things like that with her, that character in particular.
Yeah. You mentioned Tolkien's also rather elaborate world building. He also invented a language for the elves. And I was wondering, where did you draw your resources from for the stories?
For the languages in particular?
Yeah, but also the worlds and also their spirituality. Because each tribe, let's call them tribes, has their own gods, their own ideas, their own complete cultural background. Yeah.
Well, for that, because I was sort of thinking of the Silk Road and that situation of a trade route spanning a continent.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at the real world for sort of models of kind of clusters of customs and language groups, because I don't make up languages, but I tend to take the names or sort of the sounds from languages and so that all the people within a certain culture, the names sound as though they go together, and the place names sound as though they go together. And so I have sort of Old Norse-ish ones and sort of Celtic-ish ones off in their Ashvar. His name is different. He just he took someone else's name after he killed him, and so that's not his original name. But so his name doesn't fit his people. But those I used a Cornish dictionary for that, one of the sort of more obscure Celtic languages. I mean, outside the English speaking world, I guess. And I found things that are sort of influenced by kind of vaguely Mongolian sounding things. And I just did stuff like that to get names and place names and things. And for the cultures themselves, they were partly influenced by real world things and partly made up and partly sort of mix and match to let something new evolve. So as to have some contrasting things, but things that seemed to all go together as part of one world that had a lot of contact back and forth. And so it kind of worked like that.
And you said the Norse came into it. We were wondering, because we spoke about Black Dog, and the title character of this book, the Black Dog, he shares
if there was
a body.
If there was another influence for that,
exactly,
from the Star Trek universe.
That itself, I don't know. I wrote about shapeshifters ever since I was a kid. And he was sort of almost inevitably going to be a shapeshifter of some sort when I started. And the story actually began just with the idea of him, he's a fairly young man at that point. And he's just was in a city or a town being attacked by somebody else. And he's in a bad mood because his girlfriend dumped him. It's not his town. And why is he having to, he's there, he's going to fight to defend it, but it's not his town. And then he's possessed because this creature possesses him because he just stops to help a child. And so basically he's angry about it. He's got to sort it out. And it just sort of, that happened. I don't know where that came from, but that was the seed that started the whole story. And then working on that, that aspect of it doesn't really come from anything else, because that's something I've been writing in various forms for so long. I mean, I think when I was quite young, I read Patricia A. McKillop's Riddle Master series, and there are shapeshifters in that. And when I was really, really small, I really liked the fairy tale, the Grimm's fairy tale, Little Brother and Little Sister, with the one with the various springs in the forest, and they say the springs are saying, don't, whoever drinks from me will turn into a tiger, and the sister's telling her little brother, don't do this, don't do it, you'll turn into a tiger and eat me up, but I'm so thirsty, and they keep going. He turns into a deer or a fawn. I really liked that one. And so that's got the whole shape-shifting thing in it too.
Okay. And your gods, or the gods in this story, they are, let's say, they are not gods that reside somewhere in the ether, but they are very present in your books.
Yeah, they're gods of the earth, and they are spirits of a place, and they're tied to their place. So most of them, there are sort of wild gods who don't have any people who worship them, but most of them are kind of tied to a place that has people, and the people worship them. But the people also have to look after them because they can defend themselves to some extent, but not a lot. And so you have these gods that are, I mean, some of them kind of get delusions of grandeur and have big temples and things, and priests and priestesses, and others are just sort of, you're having trouble in your life. You go around, have tea with the god and discuss it. Sort of like they're an aunt or an uncle. They're your old grandmother, someone who's kind of seen a lot and thought about things a lot, and you can talk things over and sort out your own mind and get some advice. And so there's that aspect to the relationship for a lot of people with their god. Holosein, the main character, his relationship with his god is very much like that. And so it's a bit embarrassing when he ends up bound to serve some other goddess. It's a bit awkward for him. It's just, and frustrating because he can't really go home and be among his own people in the same way.
Exactly. Yeah, because of the black dog.
Which is very hard to control.
Yes, indeed.
Cranky.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a dog.
Not a good dog.
Not a good dog. Nope, definitely not. And it also reminds me a little bit what you just said about the gods of Greek mythology. Did this also come into play in your mind when you wrote them?
Not necessarily Greek specifically, but a lot of the pagan gods who were not all powerful and who were carrying on, having love affairs and having mortal children and semi-mortal children and having feuds and getting into snits and this sort of thing. So that, the Greek gods are like that. The Roman gods are like that.
The Norse gods too?
Yeah, to some extent. They didn't seem to take mortal lovers as much, but it was almost they had their own history and didn't interact except for maybe the story of, I think it was Thor, isn't it, who's going around, or was it Odin, sleeping with sort of three different women, creating sort of the three different classes of people, the warriors and the thralls and stuff. But aside from that, they weren't having mortal affairs quite as much as the Greek gods.
Gods.
But yeah, the Greeks are a good example for that too, because then they also have all these other characters, creatures who aren't gods, but they've got all the dryads and nymphs and satyrs and things. True. And so I have all these sort of nature spirits. The demons in my world they're not that different from the gods, but they don't tend to get involved with humans in the same way, and they can wander around and stuff.
Yeah,
they don't have to stay in their place.
You just said demons. I was wondering, since you're the author of the book, if you could clear it up for me, because a black dog, everybody else constantly calls him a demon. My idea of a demon is slightly different. I mean, you said he's not a good dog. He's not a good boy. Yeah, but
it's more negative.
You want him on your side.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the thing with the demon, the word demon, if you think of Greek and Roman, again, you've got like daemon, the nature spirit thing, or a spirit of a place. And so in this world, I used demon to be a sort of a creature, like a supernatural creature who isn't a god, but who is a spirit of the land, like Mickey, the werebear. His mother was a bear demon. So she was sort of the spirit of this forest called the Hardenwald, a bit of German or Norse in there.
Okay. I see.
And so she was a demon. But the black dog is not, people think it's a demon and refer to it as a demon, but it isn't actually. And as the story, as you go through the 5 books, you eventually do find out what it was, what the black dog is, and people keep assuming it's this and assuming it's that. They're kind of wrong.
Yeah. Also, our idea of demon is in this context completely wrong. I mean,
it's very much not the Christian idea of a demon being sort of a fallen and evil creature.
Yeah, true.
Demons are just, they're not interested in you, usually. Mickey's an exception.
A bit like sharks and humans. They don't want to eat us because we don't taste that good. Yeah. Same with demons, obviously.
Yeah. They don't want to eat you. Yeah. They probably don't want to sleep with you, except for Mickey.
Thank goodness.
He's quite sexy. Moth obviously thinks so.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And your idea of the reborn gods, because Atalissa, the one in the book Black Dog, at the beginning she's a girl.
Yeah.
And she's constantly reborn. I mean, the idea of being reborn is somehow familiar to us. But like you said, being a vulnerable god is not so familiar.
Yeah. She was not all the gods do this. She was sort of an exception. And later on you find out, why in the book, why this particular goddess chose to be reborn in a human form over and over, and then kind of got into the habit of it and forgot why she began doing it in the first place. But it made for a very interesting story because you had a goddess who had a lot of memories of her past and things, but not any kind of divine powers. Until she grew old enough to kind of handle them. And so you have her learning to be a better person maybe than she had been, because she'd been very protected and isolated by her priestesses, as though she was sort of like, they kind of formed a shell around her almost, the priestesses and the temple, and that it had ended up cutting her off from her world, her little world of her lake and her people, and going off, becoming just the daughter of a caravan guard, kind of broke all that and let her rethink. And so at the very end, I think she's reforming how changing how she interacts with her people and her temple and her priestesses, who at the end are going off and getting married and things instead of being this celibate order. Because I mean, if your goddess is doing it, you should be allowed to too.
Yeah, absolutely true. And what was also interesting, sorry, Tika, about the priestesses was the fact that they are not just priestesses. They're also mercenaries.
Yes, which, I mean, you got that in the Middle Ages, of course, with the various militant orders acting as guards on the pilgrim route during the Crusades and things like that. So some of the militant orders, they weren't exactly mercenaries, but you could hire them.
Yeah.
And so I thought, how does a temple like this get some funding? It's how do these warrior priestesses, who aren't actually at war with anyone, they conquered some outlying villages a while ago, like a few generations ago. They need to, keep their skills up. And so serving as mercenaries, guarding, they're not doing the desert caravans, but the traders through the mountains and stuff. And so that seemed a sensible sort of thing that they would probably be doing. And it was kind of fun to kind of, I don't know why I still had at that point, I don't know why I decided to actually have this sort of celibate order of priestesses, because that seems to be a very rare thing in this world. There's only 2 or 3 gods that you run into that actually even have a really organized priesthood. It just, that was one of the things that was sort of early on in the story that I didn't sort of sit and think, what will I do? It was just sort of there. So, yeah.
I just wanted to say that it's probably interacting with the people. It's also affecting her as a goddess, how she kind of leads or reigns over the people.
Yeah, she's very much, by the end, I think they're going to be a much more democratic monastery or nunnery temple.
A different kind of theocracy.
Yeah, I think too, she's very much, she lost control of things by choosing to be incarnated, because there's always going to be this period when she's a child needing to be told, don't do that. Go and wash your face.
Yep.
Eat your vegetables, whatever. And priestesses are human. And there's going to be the ones who are the teachers in charge of this child who's going to be their goddess someday. But meanwhile, they're, having to change her diapers. And this is, people like that can get used to being the one who tells you what to do. And, well, she's, for her own good, will look after this.
Yeah.
And then because she might become an old lady, and then you've got to look after things for somebody very elderly. And generally, the goddess began losing that perspective of age and of enduring, not age, but of having an enduring span of many lives, I think.
Yeah. And what I also liked about this first book of yours, when you let us know about the background, how this attack happened on the temple where the goddess lived. What I liked was the fact that you made the head priestess not some goody two-shoes woman, but a rather conniving woman. I mean, she did the wrong thing, maybe for the right reasons, but she's not better than a male head.
She's there to get things done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I always do try to write people who are just people. And so that was interesting. And to realize that she was actually, not, I don't know how much we want to give away, but she was not very, she thought she was looking towards sort of like the long-term improvement of things, but was she really doing this? Or was she really just serving her own interests and acting out of her own very human and not very noble impulses, having had this affair in her past?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And coming to the question of fantasy in general, since the turning of The Lord of the Rings into these 3-part movies, do you think the perception of fantasy has changed?
I think it has. I mean, I think it got a lot more people reading fantasy, but I think they were also began looking, because of course the movies in some ways were very superficial. Some of the things that they cut out.
Yep.
And some of the things that they changed were really, really wrong. But that's a completely different interview. I have opinions. But
please voice them. Feel free.
Faramir, what were they doing? What were they thinking? They missed the point entirely. But anyway, yeah, it has. I think it made people. I don't know. I think fantasy has become less contemplative. But of course, that could be modern taste. Mystery novels too are having less space to slow down and think about things, I think. But I think fantasy, that is something that has changed in fantasy, and whether you can attribute it to movies, to the Game of Thrones TV show, things like that. I don't know if it can be attributed to that or not, but I do think that lately things have become shallower often. And I think that is the part of this thing where you have to have something somebody's going to be getting killed on every page. No, but you sort of have to have this continual
pace
of and kind of rushed in that nobody does sort of stop and slow down and have that kind of have some quiet, the things that show why this world is worth fighting for, that everybody's fighting over, that what the people are actually fighting for. It tends to emphasize the politics and the war and whatnot, but less the things, the home life and the idea that this land is something like that you're fighting for, is something that has beauty in it and sort of older sorts of values.
Yeah, now that you mentioned it, Not
Sorry, I meant older,
Yeah.
like older literary values, not that this is like an old-fashioned value, but just things older books used to have more depiction of that sort of thing. I think.
what is worth preserving, because maybe come to think of it, now that you mention it, when I think back of myself reading Lord of the Rings and the first part, it's rather slow. It's slow
Yeah.
going. There is a lot of description, a lot of telling how the landscape and what's going on and the journey, and no action, not a lot of action. And now that you mention it, I think that's what he was trying to tell us. Look at this world where those people live, and like you said, why is it worth preserving? Why is it worth fighting for and saving
Yeah.
it?
I might be wrong, but I have the impression that some years ago, fantasy books were much longer than they are sometimes now. I think if the book's shorter, you don't have that much time to describe a lot of things.
That's very true. Yeah.
So
You
might
need
be right.
the space to create a world in, because if you're writing a mystery novel set in, Berlin, you've got a world that people know.
Mhm.
They can go and look at a map.
Yes. Yeah.
You don't have to explain to them, what this particular historical thing, even if it's historical, you don't have to explain the details of
Yeah.
in the same way.
Yeah.
You don't have to explain what the U-Bahn is.
Yeah.
People know.
Yeah, true. But you have to explain it when you build a new world, like you do in fantasy, or let's say in sci-fi.
Yeah, you have to do all of that to create the world that people can then go and fall into.
Yeah. Have we lost the patience then?
I don't know. There are still lots of very fat books, but when I read them, I find that an awful lot of the fatness tends to be, I'm not going to name any books in particular, but it tends to be sort of padding in fights or padding in politics, in arguing and things like this, and people doing horrible things to other people in a way that doesn't advance the plot. It's almost like it's just there because you need more of that, but it becomes more of the same. It doesn't change the characters. It doesn't move the story forward. It's like sex in a bad romance. It's not doing anything. And it should be, if it's going to be there. And so I think, that's kind of sometimes is the extra extra pages are coming in there instead of something that will work on more than one dimension, in more than one dimension.
Could it be that if there's too much, let's say too much description, that people lose
interest?
Their attention. It loses their attention.
Yeah.
Like in films, and so that's why they put in, let's say, more action.
Yeah.
Even in the books.
Yeah. You have to get a balance. And I suppose as tastes change, the balance changes. And my taste isn't catching up to what's happening these days. I don't know.
So they are going to reshoot Lord of the Rings, or the plan, at least. Yeah, exactly.
There's lots of other good fantasy out there they could make movies of. I could recommend some.
The first one is called Black Dog. If any of the producers is listening, yes. And we have a few more. So
you get lots of scenery and
Yes.
lots of fighting.
Yes.
Lots of fighting.
Lots of action right from the start,
Lots of
actually.
action. Lots of politics.
Yes, as well.
Some good special effects with all the shapeshifters and so forth. We need that. Beautiful
no lack.
landscapes.
Yes.
You'll get to go. You get to go and film, and in
Where?
And
Where?
use
all
CGI.
of Eurasia, you could all over.
True, absolutely. Or just use a green screen or blue screen. CGI is very.
That wouldn't be any fun.
I know it
But
wouldn't.
it's cheaper, I guess.
You
Yeah.
need mountains and lakes and steppes and forests.
Mm.
Lots of travel for the crew. I mean, they'd love that.
Yeah, but who's going
Camels.
to pay for it?
You need to go and get some camels.
Yes.
Well, obviously, it will be like a big blockbuster.
Obviously, yes. And I mean, the first book alone, we could make them 3-part.
Ooh, this could go on for a while.
Yeah. See? Problem solved. They would be busy for the next 10 years at least. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely true. You said at the beginning that the planning wasn't really thought through. But I suppose at some point you had to work on your writing process. And I'm imagining, just me, that you have this huge wall in your house where you have lots of information, lots of characters, lots
color-coded.
Yes, and color-coded as well. Did it work out like that in the end?
I do sometimes write things on a whiteboard, and I have notebooks that I scribble things in. But mostly I have a wall of books. And then more books. Yes, more books. And there are more books. More books. And more books. And some guitars. Mostly I have these books. And so I make stacks of the books that I'm that are sort of like shaping and influencing the thing that I'm currently working on. And I think I sort of, when I was waving this, actually, I'm going off on tangents now, but this is, let's see.
Really?
This is the book. This is the spine of the whole Gods of the Caravan Road.
Ah, okay.
It's a natural history of realms of the Russian Bear. But so it goes from, Siberia, the deserts, the Volga Delta. It's just talking about the landscape and the plants and the animals. And that kind of shaped the landscape of it. So come back to your question, the planning. In each book, sort of the next one is starting to take shape for me. But sometimes the characters will end up changing the shape of that. But I always sort of knew roughly what was going to happen in the very end. And so that was going to be the end of the journey, although I didn't quite know what shape it was going to take. But some of the stuff with Moth in the end, because we haven't talked about Moth much, but she's the character who sort of ties everything together as her thread of story. And so I knew kind of where that was going. And so everything else had to kind of travel towards that, bringing in encounters with most of the other 7 devils. One of them has actually been killed in a short story that happens before Black Dog begins. But that kind of provided, what would you call it? Sort of like the main route. And then the other stories had to weave and twist around that. And they could be shaped by things that I didn't expect when I started. Like, for The Leopard and the Lady, I didn't plan Ashvar and Gu, the assassin and his friend and lover, who is eventually, you discover, is a god. Ashvar came into the story merely as an assassin. He was supposed to assassinate somebody and probably get killed. And that was going to be kind of like the catalyst that kicked off events. But he was so interesting. And he kept on getting more and more interesting. And I had put Gu in so that he had someone to talk to, because otherwise you have this partially semi-mad person traveling alone. And that's really boring. So I put Gu in for him to have someone to talk to. And then Gu took over. And Gu took over the next 3 books. And he's still in the final book, he's still a very big influence and involved in shaping what happens. And I didn't plan him at all. He just appeared.
So who is whose sidekick then?
Well, that's a good question. And I thought Raymond Swanland, who's the cover artist for the first 4 books, and then the publisher was sold to another parent company, and they didn't have Swanland do the 5th cover, but Swanland did the first 4 books. And he answered that question really well on the covers of The Leopard and Gods of Naban. If you just look at how Ashvar and Gu are sort of standing in relation to one another, who's protecting whom, it changes between the 2 of them. On the Leopard cover, Gu is obviously defending Ashvar. And on Gods of Naban, Ashvar and Iva, you can't really see Iva very well because she's under the letter G, but Iva, who's a minor villain in the first book, but Iva and Ajvar are defending Gu, and he's sort of the central figure on the cover of Gods of Naban. And so the whole relationship between them changes, between who is orbiting who is the sidekick, and who is the central character shaping how things go for the two of them.
It's interesting because that made me think, the question also made me think, like you said, you can't have this one solitary character. It's boring. You need someone to bounce ideas off and dialogue. And made me think of Sina and Gabrielle. Sorry, but and who is whose sidekick in the end? The question remains. It's changing, isn't it? As well.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some way, it's dependent on each other.
True. Yeah, that's me and my Sina brain. But sorry about that. Just going off.
Going off in the wrong
direction.
Holmes and Watson. Also too.
Yep. True. But
not changing.
Let's be honest. Watson isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer.
It depends. He's. I like the way he was played in
Sherlock. In Sherlock, maybe.
No. Earlier, Jeremy Brett's Holmes and Hardwick. Edward Hardwick.
Yeah, there were two of them.
Yeah, and they were both very good. But the second one is sort of like stuck in my mind as like, he is the true Watson.
Yeah.
And it is more of a partnership there. Yeah. And that's when you read them, really, that's there. It didn't put things there. The Sherlock Holmes with Jeremy Brett, it didn't put things that weren't there really, except for letting Mrs. Hudson have a bit more interplay with them.
Yeah.
But again, it worked really well. That was a good partnership, I thought.
It was also, I would say, it was also a good portrayal.
I think he's the one true Sherlock.
True. Yes, I fully agree.
Brett.
As much fun as the others were, but Jeremy Brett, I fully agree. Yeah, he's the one.
Yeah.
Just speaking of, he's the one. Sorry, I'm losing track here. Who's your perfect Poirot then? I have to ask. Sorry, teacup. Just.
I'm not sure.
Mine is David Suchet.
Yeah, I'm thinking he's probably the one that I think of when I think of Poirot.
Good answer.
Yep.
Should be personal choice.
Yes, it should be personal choice. But
coming back to reading.
Yeah, sorry.
Do you still discover some new aspects when you read Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, or I find, even if it's not like necessarily discovering new things, that sort of on different readings, you find you're paying attention to something differently, or maybe reading and looking at the map more closely than you might have on other times. That kind of thing. So it's not just sort of reading it and absorbing the same thing over and over. It's, yeah.
I think you look more into the details because you know the overall story.
Very much. And just the details of language and how he uses the words.
Yeah. And you've also written for children, fantasy for children.
Yeah.
Why, in your opinion, is it important for children to dive into the world of fantasy?
Oh, lots of reasons. I mean, reading fantasy as a child, it really shows you other possibilities, and it really, it can take you away, and children can be very stressed by all sorts of things. And it takes you to some other place where you've got other possibilities and a much wider world. And that's certainly reading fantasy as a child myself. That was one of the things that it gave me, was just this much bigger world, and a world where you or a young person can have control over your own destiny, and sort of like in the fairy tale, it's the same thing as in a fairy tale. You go off, you go away, and then things happen, but you're the one making the choices. And of course, that's not usually the case when you are like 10 years old.
True. Yeah.
And in fantasy too, maybe not so much now, but in the children's fantasy of earlier generations, there tended to be an expectation that children would be reading about young people who were older than themselves. So you'd have 7 and 8-year-olds reading about people having adventures who were still young, but they were probably teenagers or something. But sort of in a time before the invention of teenagers, they were just sort of like young people between child and adult, but it wasn't a teen concern kind of thing. It's like in historical fiction, Rosemary Sutcliffe, who wrote about young people, teens and young men, mostly young men. She has a few where the main characters are a woman, but not very often. And those were read by children, but they're reading about Roman officers, say, or young warriors, but they're still children's books. Not so much now, because people really think children need to read only about kids their own age. But it's sort of a kind of an imaginatively liberating thing, I think, for kids to kind of cast themselves forward a few years and kind of aspire to that kind of maturity. The maturity of being 14 and in charge of your own destiny.
Seems so grown up when you're just 8.
Yeah, true.
I've also written 2 nonfiction books about children's literature. Since when do books especially written for children or young adults exist?
Well, I think it was with the Victorians that you particularly got that happening. And they began to look on children as sort of existing as a state of being of their own, rather than just being, children.
Small adults.
A phase you were going through becoming adults, and that you needed to just train them up for that. It was the Victorian era where you really got childhood being regarded as a very separate state that needed different things, not just to be taught to read and things, but needed stories that were different stories to read. And so you got children's books becoming a kind of a big thing at that point. And that's kind of when you get the roots of children's fantasy, that as a literary thing, as opposed to being children just, taking part in the telling and retelling of fairy tales and myths and legends, and just your sort of local kind of, not local, but, just the sort of the stories that everybody tells. But you get things being written specifically for children that are meant to be not for adults, really. Even though adults, of course, read them, but you get Alice in Wonderland, and there are earlier things too, but Alice in Wonderland kind of jumps out to mind immediately as a good example of that.
Yeah. Although he was a little bit of an oddball, wasn't he?
Yes. He was, but yeah.
The book's still good.
And you get Nesbit too, writing both adventure stories and historical stories and fantasy. But again, her personal life was interesting in a different way. She lived with her husband and her husband's mistress, and took some of her husband's mistress's children as her own.
Okay.
They were
fascinating.
Yeah. So the Victorian, well, she was more Edwardian, Victorian into Edwardian era. So she was later, but not exactly the straight-laced.
Who would have thought? What's going on behind the scenes? Closed curtains.
Yeah.
Do you get an idea, and do you know if it's going to be an adult fiction or an idea for a children's book? Or do you sit down and say, okay, I want to write a children's book now?
Usually I would get the idea first, and then it would sort of, this is going to be for children or for teens. The Tory books, I really just wrote for myself, something that I would have wanted to read when I was a kid that I would have wanted to read now. And so they have that kind of, I don't know, they are children's books, but they have some, as they go on anyway, they get some layers and some complexity that are the kind of thing that I really enjoy now too. And so I think they're a bit more universal in age than just a children's book, whereas my the Warlocks of Telverden series, which is sort of a teen series for teens is more just that. There are adults that enjoy them, and adults can certainly enjoy them. But Tori has more that kind of fairy tale quality that is a story being told to everyone. I think that's what I was aiming for anyway.
Do you think that fantasy authors are more daring than authors from any other genre?
Depends what you mean by daring.
To cover topics that others wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole?
Well, certainly the fantasy can provide scope for that by sort of setting something outside of the real world, outside of here, outside of now. And so it can be safer to put it outside to talk about it. And then, of course, you get people using it that way for political allegory or to write about things that it's not safe to write about in your own culture. That you can write about things in a sort of slightly sideways manner that people can read, and maybe it will have meaning for them that isn't there on the surface, that maybe you meant to put there. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you didn't think of it being read that way, but someone's taking it from that and finding some strength from it. So there's certainly scope for that maybe isn't always there in realistic fiction.
Yeah. And KV, what would be your advice for any other aspiring fantasy author out there?
I think one thing I would say would be to write the stories that you want to read and not to look at the market. Because now, I think now more than ever, what agents and editors and publishers are saying that they're looking for is changing so quickly that, there's no point writing to what they say they want, because by the time you've finished your book and polished it and, written and if you're like me, you write and you rewrite and you rewrite and you polish. And by the time you've done all of that, what they think they're looking for is going to have changed, because something else will be fashionable, will be the trend. And that can be right now is like changing every single year, maybe even every 6 months. Yep. So write the book that you want to read, that's got the things in it that you want to read, the things that you feel you need to read, the things that maybe you're not quite finding quite right for you in other books, kind of thing. Because there'll be other people out there that want to read that, if that's what you're hungry for, there are other people going to be hungry for it too. And so, do that, because it can be a long and horrible business. And so you want to be doing something you love.
Yeah. Yes.
And not just kind of trying to produce a generic product.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it can take years.
Yeah. Now, questions from the audience. The audience. Would you like me to ask your question, or would you like to ask them yourselves?
You.
So far, you have only 2 questions you sent our way. And the first question was, when were you in Berlin?
I was in Berlin in the spring of 1985, it would have been. I think, yes. I was on a 3-month exchange that I grew up in Ontario, and the school system there had an exchange program, a high school exchange program with Germany, and I think they also did it with Spain, maybe someplace else, I don't know. But I ended up in Berlin, which I came from a small village outside the city of Kingston, and I ended up in Berlin. I didn't know that you had to press a button to make a bell ring to make the bus stop. So it was very enlightening. I'd never been on public transit before.
Okay. Well,
I love the S-Bahn. I was in Frohnau. So I was in a very nice green part of Berlin.
Okay.
And I really also liked the fact that I could go for a bike ride in the woods and not get lost. Because you go, oh, there's the wall. There's the wall. If I got really lost, I could follow, because Frohnau is right at the very top and had the wall around it. So I could follow the wall around until I came back out.
And you didn't have to be worried about bears.
No, there are no bears. Not-
But was it also a bit frightening because it's a very large city?
It was very unnerving. It was just a strange experience, but a very interesting one. And to go downtown by myself with just, my bus pass and my very iffy German and explore and go into shops. It was just completely different from anything I'd ever done before. And yeah, it was frightening. And I went up to Denmark to see relatives too. And that meant taking a train through East Germany.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And so that was kind of, you had guards with submachine guns and sniffer dogs coming onto the train to check under the seats to make sure you weren't hiding people, I guess.
Yeah.
And they're all a very different experience. And I've always been very interested in history too. And so Berlin is right in the heart of a lot of history. And a lot of it was still very apparent then, just in the state of the buildings and things. And things like Anhalter Bahnhof, just this shell, the front facade of it and things like that were quite fascinating. And I'd read a lot of Cold War spy fiction. I really liked Le Carré and Len Deighton, or Dayton, or however you pronounce it, and had the really interesting thing of just going for a bike ride one day and ending up in is it Lubars? A section of Berlin where there were still dairy farms and things.
Okay.
And sort of, I read about this in a book.
Now
so that was really neat. And like, characters were here.
Yeah. And the other question was, and I suppose might be a hint in your first answer, where did you learn German?
Yeah, I started studying German in high school, in part because I wanted to study Old English at university, and German is a good preparation for that.
Yes.
And then I went to Germany and sort of sink or swim.
A colleague told me, who's from Slovakia. She learned German in school. Then she came to Austria. She thought she knew German, came to Austria, and realized she couldn't speak German, more or less. Did you have a similar experience?
In Berlin, it was all right. I read it better than I can speak it. I've been to Vienna.
Yeah.
And it was sort of all right because everyone could tell I was a tourist, and they spoke slowly and carefully to me. And I was speaking German. The best conversation I had was with a young man who was trying to sell me bootleg tickets to the opera because I looked like a tourist. And I don't know what his native language was, but it wasn't German. And so we were both speaking slowly and carefully. And that was my longest conversation in Vienna. I didn't buy any tickets, but, it was a nice chat.
Can imagine. Yeah. You see, there you have it. Isn't it the same with English? I mean, US Canadian, very near to the USA, and your English is similar a little bit.
Quite similar.
Yeah.
The accent's a little different, but it's
exactly.
getting less different.
And then you have the United Kingdom, the British English.
Yeah.
The same, you are divided by the same language. It's a little bit like us and the Germans.
Or New Zealand.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which can be very different.
Yeah.
Even to English speakers.
Yeah. Parts of Africa.
Yeah. South Africa. Yeah. It's also different. Also, the accent is very different. And Kevi, may I ask about future plans regarding your fantasy series or maybe a new series?
I'm working on something now, but I've been working on it a while because I got very burnt out, very tired, and I just sort of felt I was going in circles and stuff. So I took a break and I built a guitar, and then now I'm going back as soon as I get my garden cleaned up. I'm going back to writing, and I'm hoping to finish it. I'm not sure how saleable it is. So I don't know whether it will ever find a home, but I've got another plan for another big epic fantasy series after that I hope to be starting working on this summer. The thing I'm working on right now is set in a forest. and involves dragons and human sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
A young man who's been sort of forced by his mother into the role of the priest who performs these sacrifices and is a bit messed up because of it. And another young man whose story is mostly told 200 years earlier, but he's kind of back from the dead. I mean, he's one of my characters, right? There's a lot of people come back from the dead. He's back from the dead. But you get his story in the past as he and his brother go off, or sort of forced to go off and fight an invasion of dragon worshippers. And then, yeah, things happen.
But there is not
Lots
going.
of stuff.
Yeah, but there's not going to be a mother of all dragons.
No.
No.
Just the father of all dragons.
Just the father of all dragons.
There's a mother who might be a dragon.
Ah.
And there's a grandmother who definitely is a dragon, and she's not very nice.
Okay. But she has nothing to do with fashion or anything.
No, she definitely has nothing to do with fashion.
Okay, good. Just ask.
Yeah, no. Very few of my characters have anything to do with fashion.
Just asking because, you know, the devil wears Prada and so on. And they always called her the dragon lady, so just me. Yes. Yeah, I know my strange mind, sorry. Any more questions, Teacup? The audience. Any more questions from you?
No.
No? No? Yeah, not for me either. KV, thank you so much for making time for us.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
For joining us. It was absolutely wonderful talking to you.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was very nice to actually see all your faces.
Same here. You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.